We're back, and we have a great pleasure in introducing Ambassador Rivkin, who will be our keynote speaker because he brings a multiple he brings multiple dimensions to this as a businessman, as ambassador to France, as the head of the Economic and Business Bureau in the State Department, and now as the head of the Motion Picture Association. I know the name changed in 19. Did I get that right? Uh, and which is a major trade association of the United States. So he's got actually more potential ways of approaching this subject than most of us have. But he also was telling us earlier in some conversations that when he was ambassador to France, he also had a particular connection to Thomas Jefferson. So his full bio is in your program. So with that, Ambassador Rivkin, Charlie, take it away.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Newman. And, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I want to extend a special appreciation to the Academy and the Thomas Jefferson Foundation for sponsoring this fantastic conference. And, it's more than an honor for me to be a part of the American Academy of Diplomacy, because not only has diplomacy been sort of a higher calling for me personally, but it's something of a family affair. When I was 6 years old, my family created the William R. Rivkin Award at the State Department with the help of my godfather, Vice President Hubert Humphrey. And the award is named after my late father, and it's given to mid-level Foreign Service officers who exhibit intellectual courage and constructive dissent. And every year since 1968, my family and I have been proud to present an award that encourages all voices to be heard so that our foreign policy can better reflect who we are and what we truly stand for. So I speak to you today unabashedly as a deep believer in diplomacy and a lifelong friend of Europe who, as a child, lived with my family in Luxembourg, where my dad was ambassador. And then as a young student, I lived and studied for a year with a French family in Brittany. And later in my professional career, I was privileged to serve as the US ambassador to France and Monaco. And then as Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, as the ambassador said. And now in my current capacity as chairman and CEO of the Motion Picture Association, which is one of America's most export-oriented industries, I continue to recognize Europe as an enduring friend and partner. So in all these chapters of my life and career, I have long appreciated and recognized the deep and enduring value of our shared history with Europe, as well as our essential diplomatic, military, cultural, and business ties. So my response to the central question we're discussing at this conference, does Europe matter to America, will surprise no one. That answer has always been an emphatic yes. So today, I want to touch upon some of those experiences as I talk about this deeply important relationship and why it matters to our mutual future, and just share a few passing thoughts too on Thomas Jefferson, who was, after all, one of our first envoys to France when our country and our relationship with France and all of Europe was in its infancy. So I'd like to start, if I may, with a few experiences during my 4.5 years as ambassador to France, where I came to viscerally understand the deep connection between America and our oldest ally. So the first anecdote has me jumping out of a plane over the fields of Normandy. But before you think I'm indulging in some self-serving heroic anecdote, let me hasten to correct you. I'm deeply scared of heights, and I was very, very terrified during this experience. But in 2012, my defense attaché at Embassy Paris asked me to join about 150 American and French veterans in what I'm told was the first ever parachute jump by a sitting US ambassador to France. And we actually jumped from 12,000 feet to commemorate the anniversary of the D-Day landings. And we were marking the date in 1944, of course, when American and Allied paratroopers descended at night in the area around Saint-Mère-Église in Normandy. It was a safely staged exercise in which a member of the elite US Army's Golden Knights parachute team was literally attached to me as I made the jump. But I got to admit, I felt some trepidation landing in front of a crowd of 25,000 people in live French television. especially because I actually neglected to run this by the State Department or the White House for their approval. And with the cloudy skies and 25-mile-an-hour winds that day, a lot could have gone wrong in a very public way, but it was okay. Because I knew that this jump paled in comparison to what those brave men had endured exactly 68 years ago that day, hanging in the darkness and facing enemy fire. And so as the orchards and hedgerows of Saint-Mère-Église came up to meet me, I could actually close my eyes and think about how so many things had changed in those 7 decades, at least in the most obvious ways, but how so little had changed in terms of what truly mattered, namely our enduring friendship. As ambassador, I got that same powerful sense of historical unity every Memorial Day when I attended a ceremony at Belleau Wood near the Marne River outside of Paris. The United States Marines consider this place, as many of you know, to be sacred ground because it's where during World War I, they advanced in the face of overwhelming gunfire, and the US forces suffered thousands of casualties while charging and ultimately overwhelming the German machine gun nests. But by doing so, they saved the city of Paris, and for their incredible bravery, they forever earned the nickname Devil Dogs. And I remember one year when the commandant of the US Marine Corps delivered a speech, and he said something that has always stayed with me. He said that even though 10,000 Americans died on this very field, this very battleground, it was but a small piece of an unrepayable debt that the United States owes France for their part in the creation of America. And those words, delivered by a proud US Marine so many years later, said a lot about American history, but it also spoke a lot about our enduring bond with our European allies. And as we gather here at Monticello, albeit virtually, and we celebrate the life and ideas of Thomas Jefferson, the value and effectiveness of diplomacy and the relationship between the US and Europe, I believe we have to consider these questions. How do we ensure that our shared history continues to mean something? How do we keep that unity vibrant and alive? And how do we leverage that unity to address some of the most daunting challenges in recent memory? There could not be a more important time to consider these questions, for we are indeed at a crossroads. A recent Pew Research Center survey of 14 advanced economies this year found America standing to be at or near record lows compared to studies in recent decades. This survey included 9 European countries, and in France alone, favorable views of the United States had plummeted from 62% in the year 2000 to exactly half of that, 31% today. Clearly, there's work to be done. So I want to offer some thoughts and perspectives about how we can begin to address these problems based on my time in both the public and the private sectors. And as I thought about what I wanted to share with you today, I remembered a collection of letters sent by Jefferson himself to his consul general in Marseille in the year 1788. Now, when I served in Paris, the descendant of that consul general, whose family had kept and handed down these unpublished letters over generations, wanted to share them with me. And I read all of them, and it was inspiring to see these letters penned in Jefferson's own distinctive hand. And they spoke to his active involvement in the kind of diplomacy and commerce that has continued between the United States and Europe now for centuries. He wrote about a shipment of whale oil to America. He asked that a cargo of trees bound for Monticello avoid a stopover in Boston in winter where they might suffer blights from the cold weather. He spoke of the probability of continued peace between France and Great Britain. And I was pretty amused to read in 1788 as well that America's minister plenipotentiary considered the King of Great Britain, in Jefferson's own words, to be decidedly lunatic. But what a time that must have been to walk the boulevards of Paris in 1788 and have people ask his opinions about human and individual rights. And these are big ideas still in their infancy, shared with a people who were also experiencing a revolution of their own. It was a natural fit. 2 nations sharing the dream of building, despite all their imperfections, a new nation based on human rights. But as Jefferson once observed, the way to heaven has always been said to be strewed with thorns. And inevitably, there would be those occasions when he needed to address difficult matters with his allies. And when that happened, Jefferson liked to repair to his residence and invite guests over for what he called family dinners. As one historian noted, these meetings would always involve, quote, a well-spread table, always open and generally filled, where food would be served first, followed by what was described as a humanizing influence of plentiful wine. And that was when Jefferson would speak to them of such constitutional matters facing the National Assembly at that time as whether the king should have a veto, or if the republic should allow hereditary legislatures, etc. This was diplomacy at its most intimate, and it's best because there were three important things working together. First of all, the credibility of the United States was at its highest. Second, the idea of community was important to everyone. In fact, Alexis de Tocqueville would later describe that sense of community as one of America's, quote, habits of the heart, which he considered to include family life, religious convictions, and participation in local politics. And the third element of these Jefferson sit-downs was common purpose. Well, I believe if Thomas Jefferson were joining us today, assuming he could get his head around this Zoom thing, he'd agree that these three elements are demonstrably lacking in so much of our interactions today between people, between nations, and between the United States and Europe. At the very moment when the world should be cooperating across the Atlantic and around the globe to tackle such issues as the coronavirus and any number of environmental, civic, and democratic challenges, facts and science are being challenged from all sides. Political disputes over the most fundamental questions of what's right or wrong are severely undercutting our ability to come to any kind of democratic domestic consensus. And it doesn't help matters at all that nation states have weaponized social media in ways that obscure the truth of global challenges. In August, the German Marshall Fund reported that authoritarian regimes have spent more than $300 million over the past decade to interfere in political processes in dozens of other countries. The report finds that this malign finance, as it's called, is heavily targeted against the US and Europe. They want to deny us the shared truth that underpins domestic governance and international cooperation. In the words of Kathleen Hicks, who's director of the International Security Program at CSIS, she says, America's deep divisions are a major strategic weakness. A strategic weakness, that is, because these divisions are challenging our very ability to work with our friends, allies, and adversaries abroad. As Hicks points out, this also has implications for America's cultural appeal, a concern that is as troubling for American cultural industries as it is for America's diplomats, since it impacts soft power. There's a powerful new Netflix documentary some of you may have seen called The Social Dilemma, and it outlines one source of division. As the filmmakers see it, social media companies are mining and manipulating our attention, our basic information, and our behavior. And like the fairy tale character Rumpelstiltskin, they're weaving it into gold to sell to advertisers. Instead of being the empowered and active users we like to think we are, this film tells us that we have in fact become the commodity. This commoditization is only one of the many dangers we face on the internet, including hate speech, terrorist content, counterfeit drugs, child pornography. And those abuses also include pernicious online piracy, which is an existential threat to my industry in particular. I'll give you an example. In 2018, the US government and the European Commission both published reports critical of the world's biggest pirate cyber locker, which goes by the name of OpenLoad. It took the Motion Picture Association 2 years of investigation to finally shut down that site, because the pirates are now using the same tools of fraud and deception that are used by money launderers and election meddlers. And they were not in some faraway corner of the globe. They were operating from the heart of Western Europe, which is just one small reminder that not all threats to the rule of law are external. At the time when we and our partners around the world need to construct diplomatic solutions and strengthen the rule of law, it's heartening to see that we share the latter value. And this is one of the baseline values that is essential to resetting our transatlantic consensus. Ladies and gentlemen, if we ignore or diminish our relationship with Europe, it will be at our own peril. In the case of my industry, the film, TV, and streaming content industry, for example, the European Union is increasingly asserting global leadership on policy issues that affect our mutual future. We simply cannot afford to watch from the sidelines, detached and uninvolved. On the back of its perceived success with privacy regulation and driven by the perception that the US is simply not restraining its digital giants, the EU is now turning to regulation of digital services. It is examining regulation of artificial intelligence. It's revisiting taxation of online services. This European assertiveness could be positive in some ways and negative in others. Where you stand, as always, depends on where you sit. In the fight against online piracy, for example, the rest of the world is learning from approaches pioneered in Europe, including the legal process for blocking piracy websites, which was built in Europe and the UK and has been very, very effective. At the same time, I'm concerned that EU regulation of digital services could, ironically, result in weaker rules for online liability than Europe has in place today, which would clearly be a step, in our opinion, in the wrong direction. But whether increased assertiveness by European regulators and tax authorities proves positive or negative in particular cases, this much I know is certain. It will impact US companies. It will reflect an overall philosophy that is somewhat different and more interventionist from the way we do things in the United States. And it will influence policies of other governments around the world, as EU privacy regulation has already done. So do we currently have a real seat at the table as a trusted partner in a broader discussion with Europe about future regulation of the digital economy? You can be the judge, but certainly we should. But we must and can go further than regulatory dialogue. We must do more to reinforce our awareness and embrace of shared values around individual rights, representative democracy, and economic and environmental sustainability. We have to extend our efforts to forge consensus on other matters that affect all of us as well, such as the truth about climate change, or trusting again in our democratic institutions, or believing, for example, the findings of intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic about interference in our democratic process. In the past, we sometimes took such basic areas of agreement for granted, but no longer. We need to forge a new shared truth, a new transatlantic consensus that can underpin joint action. Building on that foundation, we can commit ourselves to working together to defend our shared values, and protecting the democratic process is a good place to start. I'm talking about the necessity of nations that fundamentally care about truth, justice, community, and the rule of law coming together to confront the broader vulnerabilities that have allowed and are still allowing our politics and our technology to become a tool for disinformation and division. Now, one way to do this is to return to the existing institutions and mechanisms designed for international cooperation, from joint diplomatic pressure to the work of groups like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, to law enforcement cooperation, to put a stop to that. All democracy-loving nations should be working together to stop that. As Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, I led the Bureau directly involved with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, better known as TTIP. It was the kind of ambitious trade deal that, in my very biased opinion, would have opened markets on both sides of the Atlantic, created jobs, and raised standards from copyright protections to labor rights. Unfortunately, it did not come to pass. But more recently, US and EU trade negotiators did manage to secure a small tariff deal, which, among other things, reduced tariffs on Maine lobsters. It seems the days of Jefferson's whale oil have clearly gone through some changes. But it was the first negotiated reduction in duties between Europe and the United States in more than 2 decades. And the fact that they achieved this under a strained relationship shows that the machinery for discrete problem solving can still operate. And that's a good thing. bilateral problem solving remains vitally necessary to navigate an endless array of regulatory headaches and sustain our massive, massive trade relationship that was discussed earlier in that fantastic panel today. Looking ahead, however, small deals are not enough. Given the challenges we will face, a growing need to go beyond our US-European problem-solving efforts and find ways to stand together on a wide range of fundamental environmental, public health, economic, and democratic challenges. These ideas are just the beginning of what we could do together in a broader US-European partnership. But our first ambition must be to strengthen that mutual understanding that the surveys say has so badly waned, to begin to repair transatlantic and international cooperation, to fight fake news by malignant foreign powers. We must first begin to repair our national relationship with the truth and begin to forge an alliance of truth with the international partners who share our democratic values. When it comes to credibility, I think that the key missing piece in almost every walk of our communal life, particularly on the internet, and at the risk of sounding as if I'm quoting directly from Alice in Wonderland, we can only do that by restoring the credibility of credibility. So let's start with diplomacy, the very level of communications between nations. And as I saw firsthand, both as ambassador and assistant secretary of state, diplomacy is an all hands, comprehensive engagement of people abroad on the part of a dedicated network of public servants, starting with the diplomats and locally engaged staff that we have in virtually every country, and supported by the equally dedicated FSOs and civil servants at Maine State. And I believe the events of the past year have continued to demonstrate some exceptionally fine examples of the career US diplomat as the consummate truth teller at home and abroad, as part of a dedicated and honorable US national security and foreign policy establishment. Yet in spite of the integrity of our amazing career Foreign Service officers, somewhere between those Jefferson family dinners and the extensive work that our dedicated Foreign Service and civil service officers do today, we nonetheless seem to have lost the confidence of our transatlantic partners. But I believe this is only a temporary condition. To rebuild trust and restore not only cooperation, but true partnership, we must all recommit ourselves to diplomacy's core values of honesty, integrity, and public service, not only in our official discourses, but in our own direct interpersonal dealings with friends, neighbors, and colleagues, in our dealings with one another as fellow citizens and fellow members of the planet, and most certainly in the relationship between the United States and Europe. When he finally left France to return to the United States, Jefferson told his French friends that he deeply regretted leaving, but welcomed the future and ongoing mission of, in his words, cementing the friendship between his own country and theirs. As he wrote to one of his correspondents, he said, "Be assured that to do this is the first wish of my heart." The problems facing our world today are too complex and too strong to face separately and divided. A close US-European partnership must be, can be, and I believe will be at the heart of everything we do moving forward. I'm sure that Mr. Jefferson would agree. Thank you.
Ambassador Rivkin, that was a great speech, great place to put us into a final discussion. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and ask you one before we go to the questions that are beginning to come in from the audience. And that is, as you look at building or rebuilding our relations with Europe, which is now multiple countries and multiple organizations, do we have a need to rebuild our own diplomatic and governmental structure, or to reorient it in some way to make, assuming we want this cooperation to work better, do we have our mechanisms correctly set?
Well, look, Ambassador, as you know, I'm in the private sector now. I'm not, in the government. I think any institution, government institution or private sector institution, can always and should always improve. The State Department needs to be nimble. It needs to react to things quickly. It needs to deal with the rapid change that's happening around the planet right now. And for that, you need the right people. You need to continue to recruit the best and the brightest. You need to, in my very biased opinion, bring back some of those extraordinary career foreign service officers who have left in recent years, and rebuild, in a way that better reflects the challenges of this new century. In my, again, biased opinion, I've always thought that economic policy is foreign policy. And I think that we can do better as an institution by marshaling, by building economic ties. When I was ambassador, you really, in some ways, are leading a sales group. You have the Foreign Commercial Service, you have the Agricultural Service, you have the Treasury Department, you have military and defense sales, but we aren't really very well coordinated, and certainly not as much as other countries in advancing our economic interests. And when you tie nations together, economically, then everything else follows. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do, and or I should say, the people that are working in the government have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. We have another question, and I'm going to give you the first crack at it, but I see that if Sean Donnelly is around, we might see if he wants to add anything. And this is, what role does the WTO, the World Trade Organization, play in the future of the US-EU relationship?
Yeah, I am going to actually defer to Sean Donnelly, because it's his area of expertise, and I think that his response would be a lot more impactful. Sean, are you there?
I am. I'm not sure if my face will pop up, but I hope you can hear me. I guess I would, in an economist's answer. So let me start my video. Sorry. There we go. Sorry. The WTO is a necessary but not necessarily a sufficient condition. I think there's a lot that the U.S. and the EU can do together in their bilateral relationship, and setting global agendas outside of the WTO. There's a lot of work to be done there, including in some other international organizations that deal with things like intellectual property or anti-corruption. But I think it is essential that the U.S. and the EU work better in the WTO. Over the past 4 years, just to pick a time frame, I'm afraid much of the time at the WTO has been spent with the U.S. and Europe sparring. The U.S. government and the Trump administration has taken a very aggressive approach to WTO, with the commendable goal of reform, but I personally would question some of their tactics, and the EU has not supported that, and a lot of our relations with the EU at the World Trade Organization have become very contentious, even on an issue like China or state-owned enterprises where we should be able to cooperate. We haven't, because we've disagreed so much about tactics and the way that our administration has approached the WTO. So I do think for a new administration, whether it's a second Trump administration or a Biden administration, it's time to take a fresh look at how we are approaching the WTO. How can we make it work? Because it is, for better or worse, the place that sets the global trade rules. There are other organizations that deal with particular sectors, including intellectual property at the World Intellectual Property Organization, but the WTO is at the core, and we need to do a better job of working with Europe to set the agenda, particularly as it applies to these new digital sectors of the economy that didn't exist when the WTO was created back in the mid-90s. The internet really didn't exist, and so it's one of the reasons we had the U.S., and I think appropriately so, updated our NAFTA agreement with the new U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement. We desperately need to update the global trade rules at the WTO. Thanks.
Thanks. It's good to have the right expertise at hand. Ambassador Rivkin, going back to you, question here. You mentioned the difference in U.S. and European approaches towards social media. Could you comment on the US administration's vocal critique of Europe taxing Google and Facebook?
Well, look, these platforms, I suppose platform is too broad of a term, but these large internet companies are under assault throughout the world, including the United States, as you saw the most recent filing against Google by the US government. I don't have a specific opinion about taxation for them, but I do think that you're going to continue to see this type of activity against these large internet players in the United States. There is a big discussion in America right now, as many of you guys know, about Section 230 of the CDA, and whether or not the immunity that was granted to internet companies when the internet was born has been abused, and whether or not the platforms that benefit from that immunity need to be more responsible in making sure that the bad content that I mentioned in my remarks isn't present on the internet. Yes, piracy is a small part of it, but it's the same side of the same equation. We need our giant internet companies to be more socially responsible in terms of helping improve the democratic process. Your specific question about taxation, it's just not something that I focus on. But a digital services tax, that is very concerning to me. If all of a sudden all of my member companies are becoming direct-to-consumer players with Disney Plus and HBO Max and Peacock, and in addition to Netflix and Apple TV Plus and Amazon Prime Video, and if Europe wants to double tax them by making them pay additional tax for being a digital delivery service, that's deeply unfair as far as we're concerned. I can't really speak to the taxation for Google and Facebook, but I can say the digital services tax in our case is really unfair.
Thanks. I have a question here which goes back to your time in Paris. And the question is shaped as to what extent did US business investors or marketers avoid contact with your embassy, and for what reason? And I suppose the flip side would be which kinds of business did come to the embassy for help?
Ambassador, something that's always bothered me is that not enough businesses understand the power of US embassies abroad as convening opportunities. We can bring the most powerful players in the entire country together for a reception, for a presentation, introduce them to major players and minor players in American business, but people don't think to ask us. And I wonder if the business community in general knows that, because the large players do know that, but many of the large players, you were talking about Google and Facebook and other the trillion-dollar American companies, they go right to the president of France. They don't need the embassy. They have direct relationships with the highest level of the government. Small and medium enterprises are the backbone of the American economy, and we can very much help them. When governors and senators come to post and advocate for the economy of their states, it's very impactful with the French. But those that know the resources that we have and know the benefit we can bring are happy to come and get this free asset, not free, you're paying your taxes, but nonetheless, the benefit of the insight of an embassy and the connectivity of an embassy in advancing American industry. I don't know how we can get the word out better, but it's just not known by most of the SMEs that I've met.
Yeah, I find often companies think of the embassy once they're in trouble, but not when they're trying to get into the market.
It's fun in the media business. I wasn't in the media business when I served as ambassador, but movies are, I think, in my mind, a wonderful diplomatic opportunity to discuss important issues. And so we would do screenings, and then we'd have big important debates about the topic of the films. But we use the embassy to convene the smartest people in the country, the leaders of the economy, and have intelligent discussions around the table. There's so many different ways you can convene. And I think our embassies do a great job. I'm in touch with at least a dozen of President Trump's ambassadors, and they're really trying their best, I think, to use the embassy as a tool to advance American economic interests.
Well, this is an example of new technology with not an old, but a tool fairly well established. years ago, in the black ages before interconnectivity, we used to get boxes of film rolls, which were sent around usually by the defense attaché's office. And in fact, I can remember screening those films on our projector, which we had to learn to operate exactly as you've said. Although once I remember screening Dr. Zhivago around the swimming pool, and in the winter scene, suddenly everybody got so cold we had to dismantle everything and move it inside. So for the next question also goes to film. And it says, with the new wave of nationalism in parts of America and Europe and increased isolation of people during the pandemic, what is the film industry doing to promote globalism and increase cultural understanding?
You know, one of the things that I found interesting about serving as an ambassador, using these movies to advance our diplomatic objectives, is that Hollywood is a pretty unique asset. For those of you that don't know, I mean, we support about 3 million American jobs and export to about 130 countries around the world in surplus with every single trading relationship. You know, and I will say that that the reason we sell so well, the reason we export and sell about 75% of our products abroad, is because we're a reflection of American society. I remember showing a movie in Paris that was an American film, but it was critical of America's role in the last financial crisis. And afterwards, the French would say, you see, Ambassador, America is responsible for all the bad things in the world. And I remember saying to them, yeah, when was the last film that was made about the Algerian War? And the reason I mentioned that, and maybe not particularly diplomatic of me, is that we're not afraid as a nation to hold up a mirror and to try to improve, to try to recognize where we haven't done a good job and to try to do better the next time. China, on the other hand, which will be the largest film market probably from now on because of the pandemic, is all internally focused because the Chinese film business works for the propaganda department. And nobody wants to watch these movies. They're doing literally billions of dollars inside China. So in answer to the question, we don't, it's not the mission of the US entertainment business to advance these ideals that you're referring to. We have never been and will never be a propaganda arm of the US government. But I think it's a pretty good thing when people can see our movies and our creativity and our stories told about American life in the far corners of the earth, showing what America is capable of. So we do it by just simply making these amazing stories well told, but we don't do it with specific intent of changing people's behavior.
I think that is certainly true. If we had any ability to manage what Hollywood does, I'd try to get them to show diplomats differently. I remember once the ambassador from one country came in, and he was, when I was the deputy assistant secretary, and he was complaining vociferously about how his country was portrayed in the movie. And I asked him, had he noticed how the American ambassador was perceived in the movie or shown? Ambassador had been shown as kind of a lying coward crouched under his desk. And ambassador allowed us how he noticed that. I said, well, when I could do something about how they show the ambassador, American ambassador, I'll do something about how they show your country. Another question from your former.
I'm sorry, Ambassador, just on that point, when I was in EB, I had these really creative people who were genius, economic doctorates. Some of the smartest people in the world on the economy working for me in the Economic Bureau, but a lot of them were really creative. And there was a number of them that kept on pitching me ideas, and I hadn't been in the entertainment business in a long, long time, but saying just what you said, that Hollywood there needs to be a movie showing the courage and heroism and the importance of a diplomat. But many diplomats stay behind the scenes and don't go, want to be in the spotlight, and it makes it hard to drive box office with that self-sacrifice and modesty. But anyway, I agree with you completely. Oh, Ambassador, I've lost you. I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Yes, when it comes to showing diplomats as heroes, I'm afraid, as one Arab friend said to me once about a different question, you could wait for this sitting down.
They're heroes to me.
Now, a serious question. From your former EB perspective, your current role, how do you see the relationship between economic diplomacy and cultural diplomacy?
Intertwined. my industry is a perfect example of the combination of economic and cultural diplomacy. We're making these movies for, as I said, for broadcast all over the planet, and it generates a tremendous amount of profit and tax-paying dollars for the U.S. government. But it also builds jobs overseas, right? So Universal Pictures is making Jurassic Park in London right now. Warner Brothers is making the new Matrix and the new Batman movies in Berlin. And there's a lot of economic activity generated. In America, every time you make a movie in a major city, it injects $250,000 a day into the local economy, which is extraordinary, because the industry is not about stars. The industry is about construction workers and electricians and hairdressers and caterers and all these blue collar workers that make up the 3 million Americans that are employed by us or supported by us. So this is a perfect example. We export, it's one of America's greatest exports, but we're also exporting our soft power. So embassies around the planet are using movies as an example of advancing cultural ties as well as economic ties. So I guess the answer to that question is they're completely intertwined. And my space is a good example of that.
Thank you. I want to go back to, I'm going to use a little bit of our time. We had a question for Dr. Reeder that we didn't get to when he was talking. And that question asks, are there instances where the friction that he described eroded America's institutional capacity to govern itself? Or are there instances where it expanded policy coherence, such as the Monroe Doctrine of which you were speaking? And it seems to be a most relevant question for today about whether the international friction eroded America's institutional capacity to govern itself. Dr. Reeder, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the question. I think it's a great question, but I'll say from the outset, I think it's a difficult question to answer because I think even answering today, what effect does foreign meddling have on our capacity to self-govern? I think that's a difficult question even to ask today, let alone 200 years ago. But I think it's a particularly sticky issue for democracies and republics because the line is so unclear between sort of foreign meddling disinformation campaigns and the democratic process itself. And ambassadors would explicitly use this. Ambassadors and agents of foreign powers would explicitly use that gray area to meddle in elections. In other words, the US Constitution allows the legitimate overthrow of representatives every election cycle. And so ambassadors would attack the administration. This one person who really perfected this was an ambassador named Carlos Martinez de Irujo from Spain. And in 1804, we don't have time to go into all of the details of him, but he basically was attacking the Jefferson administration in the newspapers. And his defense was, look, I'm not trying to overthrow the government itself, but the president is just a caretaker of the government. What I'm doing is completely legitimate because I am speaking to the true sovereigns of the nation, the people. I am going to them, and then they will decide if they want to, turn Jefferson out of office. And so it created a very shady line between foreign meddling. I think today we'd call them foreign disinformation campaigns, and the people's ability to be sovereign over their government and to make their choices in an election. I think it raised two fundamental questions. Do the people have sovereignty over their government? And so can foreign powers legitimately and permissibly influence the parameters of the people's debate about their government? It's a very sticky question for a democracy, I think, for a democracy to resolve.
But it's a sticky one that we have to deal with ourselves in the other direction, because we now have this business of ambassadors reaching out in public diplomacy to populations. And certainly Russia has been very resentful of the way some of our ambassadors have used social media to reach out to the Russian population. So we have to deal with this question both coming and going, and we're probably not going to resolve it.
And if I'm sorry, if I can just clarify one thing real quick, I think now there's a different question where what should we do if actual laws are being broken, whether it's through hacking or anything along that nature, whether it's hacking computer systems or hacking polling systems or ballot systems. I think that's a separate question about what can be done. But when it just comes to sending out disinformation to American voters, that's a really difficult question to deal with. The line becomes very hazy.
Everything gets difficult. Ambassador Rivkin, I'm going to let you come back into this. But also, I wanted to, anything you'd like to pick up on in the last discussion, but also another question. As Dr. Reeder showed us, we've been through some difficult periods of foreign relations and sort of put them so far back we don't remember them. Do you see a major lingering problems now in our European relations? This is asking you to generalize, but a lot of questions have come up about American reliability, given some of the approaches of this administration. If one posits a change, whether it's in 4 years or now, do you see those suspicions going away, or will they change the playing field in a way that we will have to deal with in some fundamental way in our policy?
Ambassador, I think it's a fantastic question, and I don't know if there's actually an answer for that right now. And I think there are a lot of people that say it depends on who's running America, and I don't want to get into politics. But I will say, when I was ambassador, there was a lot of talk about Bush versus Obama, because I followed the Bush 43 second term. And I would always make the point, I still believe today, that our deep ties with our European friends are cultural, they're economic, they're historical, and they survive any administration. They always have. And the economic ties continued, and the military ties and the intelligence ties with our closest friends continued, regardless of who was in power in the United States. I mentioned in my remarks the new variable here, which is social media and disinformation. And there is turbulence in the water right now based on what seems to be a lack of predictability and stability in American foreign policy. And you see Emmanuel Macron taking a leadership role and saying things publicly like Europe needs to take care of itself in response to America's recent position on NATO. I don't know what's going to happen next. It depends, I think, on whoever wins this election, whether it's Trump's second term or Vice President Biden's first. They're going to need to focus on the European relationship, and they're going to have to restore this trust, because if you believe these Pew Center polls, it's really bad right now. I still believe that in the long arc of history that we have too much in common with our European friends to lose that bond, but it is a bit frayed at the moment. So I think whoever wins this election needs to spend time fixing it.
And that's not going to be as easy as it might be. And it also will take us back to that question that Henry Kissinger posed many years ago. If you want to deal with Europe, what's the telephone number? So on the one hand, we have work to do, but the flip side of the question is, do you see Europe becoming somehow more coherent so that it can work together, so we can work together if we're willing to work together?
Yeah, it's an opportunity for them. Of course, Brexit does throw a wrench in that, but yeah, it's a real opportunity to force better collaboration inside the Union.
There's another question. Russia's been a big part of this conversation, of this conference, and also part of U.S. relations with Europe. And what has your experience been in your prior experience with Russia's desire for influence as an ambassador, but also what's been your experience leading the MPA as far as Russia's approach to things like digital rights and privacy?
I enjoyed my time as ambassador. I was friendly with the Russian ambassador to Paris, and we spent a lot of time together. And it was interesting to hear his talking points when I would, push his buttons. There was no major interaction with me as a bilateral ambassador with on Russian-related issues. On the entertainment side, people don't really know this, but Russia is a major market for entertainment properties, and it's a really important market for us, and has been ever since World War II. And any turbulence in that relationship is bad for our business. But Ambassador, I know what I don't know. I'm not a Russian expert. I have not devoted any of my life and career to that. I fear that I'll never be able to visit Russia, because when I was at the State Department, I was in charge of sanctions. It was hard for me to get a visa the last time I tried to go. But fortunately, we have a powerful team at the Motion Picture Association that spends a lot of time there trying to advance our interests.
Well, that is a fascinating aspect. I have one small question that came up. At one point, apparently the French used to prohibit the visit of nuclear ships. Is that still a question? And is that an issue of any larger rub in Europe?
That is really that's really funny. I didn't know that happened in the past. During my time, I'd say 50% of the Nimitz class carriers stopped in Marseille, and I have about 7 or so hats that I have on my shelf from my visits to the nuclear powered carriers. And the reason why is that America at the time had 11 Nimitz carriers, and I guess the Ford class is an upgrade from the Nimitz, and we have a couple coming online. But the Nimitz carrier was the only other nuclear powered carriers on the planet were the French ones. And the French only have one, the Charles de Gaulle. And the Charles de Gaulle is about 50% of the size of a Nimitz carrier. And so when the Truman or the Eisenhower or the Bush or any of these things came to, the French, I would take them out, on the COD, on the onboard delivery vehicle. And they were it was the most amazing representation event to take French business leaders and politicians to this floating fortress surrounded, by our impressive military. Unfortunately for me, and again, I was so enthusiastic in my role as ambassador that I just said yes whenever my defense attaché asked me to do something. As I told you in my remarks, when I landed in Normandy, it was in front of the then Secretary of the Navy, Ray Mabus, and Mabus said, yeah, you may think that's special, Ambassador, but you've never been up on an F-18 Super Hornet. And I said, well, it's because you got to get water trained, and I can't do that. And he goes, well, I'm going to waive the training. You go ahead and go up on this plane, and I go, well, if you're waiving the training, why do you have a training? And he says, because it's either, if it falls, it's either going to crash when it takes off or when it lands. And if it does, you're going to be dead anyway. So you don't need to be trained. He was just trying to spook me. But I did go up on an F-18 with the Navy. And they were doing interoperability exercises between the Charles de Gaulle and the Truman at the time, where the Rafale fighters were doing dogfights with our F-18s. And one of the Rafales hit the water and bust up, and we rescued the pilot. And I was asking the naval aviators about that afterwards, and they said that the F-18 is just a superior machine, and the French should never have tried the exercise, But I guess the point I'm making here is, yeah, it was huge intersection. France embraced having these carriers come to town. So I don't know when that changed, but when I was in Paris, it was very much embraced by the French military.
That is fascinating. I guess I remember we were competing once with the British for some sale, and they were talking about trying to sell an aircraft carrier, and I said, well, yes, we ought to buy one of your carriers too. We could park it on the back of ours as like a spare tire. It didn't go over well.